So if we look at this body paragraph, you can see all the way through that this idea of losing sight of the present is continued throughout. So Ma put her focus on looking after us. So there's that extension of that metaphor of lost sight and focus. I should probably have highlighted that in green as well. In pink, so that you could see the extended metaphor. Da, though, was constantly trying to plan out a better story. So he was not looking at what was in front of him, he was dreaming. So here you can see there's a wonderful metaphor that's being extended like the story. So this is extending the metaphor that's in the thesis and in the topic sentence. If we look here, Blackwood's memories, the first time Dad saw Thornhill Point, and then saw is repeated here as well. Notice he didn't listen to Blackwood's warnings because he's not looking at what's in front of him. He's wrapped in his visions of the future. So there's that metaphor again being focused on, and it's focusing on the thesis, which is clever. Dad didn't look at what he had that was right in front of him. He would have seen, so you can see it's all the way through, that the only way to live here was give little and take a little. And it's continued all the way through right to the end. And now it's beautifully done right at the end. He looks through a telescope. So that idea of looking from a distance rather than living in the present. So that's a clever way of maintaining your focus. It makes for nice tight writing. The other things I've highlighted are in the blue aqua colour, this idea of relationships and who the character is, and it also sets the time as well. So I highlighted this word pannier. It actually should be in green because it is actually a textual reference more so than a character relationship reference. Sorry, that's me clicking badly. So the things that I've put in green are textual references, and in yellow I've put the proper nouns, so all those capitalized words that give authenticity to my writing. I was saying in the last screencast are repeated here. So anything in quotation marks, any references to real life experiences I've either put in green or yellow. And you'll note that they're consistently through the text. So in an introduction and a body paragraph from a character's perspective, we get a real sense that the writer understands the text and is remaining focused. What's interesting is the way that she writes about the massacre. Remember, it's second-hand to the character who is writing, and she calls it a frenzy of death rather than a massacre. And this idea of him helplessly holding, a lovely example of alliteration, a gun. And if you remember the scene in the massacre, or you can reread it yourself now, that Thornhill actually stood back and watched it and couldn't be part of the bloodbath. Now that sort of information could only come to Sarah or Dolly via Dick, because Dick may have very well heard the story from Blackwood. So we've got a really clear understanding of not only the thesis being advanced, but what actually happened in the text. I just want to show you some examples of some good writing versus writing that is not as strong. So when you're writing really well, you're showing your reader, you're not telling your reader, and you're letting the reader be able to immerse him or herself in what you're writing. So let's look at the not so good one first. My father wanted to climb life's ladder and become a wealthy emancipist with wealth, power and status. Now that's telling. Have a look at when I show and I use textual detail. I remember Da telling us of the day he held up his water hands to the light, realizing as he stood in Waterman's Hall that men were stacked on top of each other like the houses in Tanner's Lane, struggling for the strips of feeble sun that pressed up against cracked glass. Okay, so we do explore this idea of life's ladder and this idea of power and status, but I show using textual information. Here's another example. Willie and the rest of us kids were really affected by my father's refusal to speak about the massacre. So that's telling. This is showing. Our lives have grown around my father's silence, the way roots of a cabbage tree might grip hold of the rocky soil. So clever imagery here of a rocky soil, the idea of growing, which we actually see in the novel, and that quotation of the roots growing around Sal and Will's relationship is exploited there. Here's another example. If only he had listened to Ma, he would have learned to give a little, take a little, rather than scarring and wounding his children with his need for power. So how might I show that? Because it's not wrong, but it is telling. Here we can use metaphor, we can use personification and imagery, and perhaps some symbolism to help us. He was so bent on fixing fences that he didn't get that for Dick there was no Rotherhithe, and there was no map which carved up parcels of land for those who didn't have to work to put bread on the table. So here, this idea of focusing on what he wants and comparing it to what Dick desires might give your reader more specific understanding of the text. He was imprisoned by his obsession with ownership and being gentry. In his mind's eye, my father could see rows of poplars standing to attention, Ma taking the air in her silk shawl from Armitage, the piercing whitewash of the stone wall that bound his estate. It was a vision splendid, and it made sense. Notice here, this word imprisoned is captured, if I highlight that in yellow, captured here by rows of poplars, which might look like bars. The idea of a stone wall might be like that of a prison. But here, the vision splendid made sense. The use of the word estate, the word Armitage, all imply a gentrified existence. This idea of being imprisoned in this particular social stratosphere is captured in this image. Here's another example. My father's burning ambition made him hit out at my mother's calm influence and succumb to his lust for ownership and status. He turned inward, closing his eyes to the soft reflection of himself in Ma's eyes. He raised his fist at her in shame because he felt unravelled and raw. Lastly, the land was drenched in blood, but time removed that evidence that a whole people was wiped out. Now that's perfectly good and clear writing, but can you draw on the text more to create a powerful image? Something had happened to the dirt in that spot, so that not as much as a blade of grass had grown there ever since. Nothing was written on the ground, nor was it written on any page, but the blankness itself might tell the story to anyone who had eyes to see. Now that quotation from the novel might help add to your writing. So, when you go to write your text, think about how you write to create the image for the descendants. How will you organize your ideas and focus on a central point so that you can arrive at a conclusion? Here's one example I'm going to read you, and I'll send you this document to show you how you might integrate quotation and use that figurative language we just looked at. First example. From his first breath, Dar was a prisoner. Nice strong start. There may have been no bars in Tanner's Lane, but poverty is as sure a constraint as a leg iron. And so he grew up hungry, this starvation taking root deep inside his heart, constantly watered by the gnawing feeling in his belly, the flat taste in his mouth, the rage that there was never enough. But being a great man, he overcame this. Like turning water into wine, he turned this hunger into a will for survival, a lust for better things to come, things he would damn well make sure came inside or outside the law. There's that reference to prison we noticed up here, but there's been a couple more metaphors in between. In that desert isle, his circumstances were unfair. It wasn't his fault his mouth lacked that silver spoon, and so it seems only just that he should take a little back from the people who had already had something. There could be no sin in thieving if it meant a full belly. Oppression clamped a steel hand, there's that reference to irons, over that jungle of London, but Dar fought his way through, carving his own path to freedom. And there's that extension of jungle and carving. A lesser man may have consigned his hopes to the Morocco works, let himself be driven under by the frigid waters of life. That's lovely personification. But not our Dar. From his hunger he yearned for fullness. So there's that great, all the way through this bit of writing, correctly extending that metaphor, and there's quite a few operating in that text. I'll send you this document so that you can look at the other examples that appear below, but when you're reading, look at how the metaphors have been extended, not just touched upon and left, but brought back into the text to enhance the meaning.